Good evening for everyone. On behalf of the Eastern Europe Studies Center, I would like to open a discussion which is dedicated for discussing a very important and relative issue, Lukashenko's regime and its future. But before we start our discussion, I would like to briefly mention what we would like to thank you, the Foreign Policy Research Institute, for helping us to organize this discussion, as well as our previous discussions that were dedicated for discussing Free CIS initiative, as well as for other discussion what we would like to organize with this institute in the near future. But for now, we would like to dedicate our word and give a floor to our moderator, Maia. Please, the floor is yours.
Andrews, thank you so much. Welcome to our guests and our participants. My name is Maia Otarashvili. I'm the Deputy Director of Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in the United States in Philadelphia. We are delighted to be collaborating with Eastern Europe Studies Center on this event and on many previous and future events, as well as publications. So I'd like to thank Laurynas for inviting me to moderate this event. As Andreas already mentioned, today we'll be talking about Belarus, the continued crisis in Belarus, not just the current situation, but also what might we expect from the regime, what might be the fate for Lukashenko regime for the rest of the year, especially in terms of Belarus's relationship with Russia, with the upcoming Zapad military exercises, also under the intensifying pressure coming from Europe and the United States. We'll also be talking about the role of specifically the Baltic states and Europe in supporting the government in exile and in supporting the movement, the freedom movements in Belarus. Today I have a great group of panelists for you. We are joined by Katia Glod, who is an analyst and political risk consultant of Central and Eastern Europe and Russia. Katia has written and spoken for the Foreign Policy Research Institute quite a bit, and we're very grateful to have her as our contributor. I also have with us Maksimas Milta, who is associate at the Eastern Europe Studies Center's Belarus program. We are also joined by Laurynas Jonavičius. He is associate at the Eastern Europe Studies Center's Belarus program, and he's also assistant professor at the Vilnius University. So the structure of today's discussion is going to be quite conversational. I want to make sure that we engage with our audience plenty and that we answer all the questions that you might have. Katia will make her remarks first, then we will listen to Maksimas make his remarks for about 5 minutes, and Laurynas will speak after Maksimas. Then we'll do a little bit of a discussion amongst the four of us, and we'll spend the next 30 minutes on audience Q&A. So please use the Q&A feature to send in your questions, and I will be sure to get through as many of them as possible. With that, let me turn it over to Katia.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Maia. Thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you very much to the Foreign Policy Research Institute and to the Eastern Europe Studies Center for organizing this event. And I'm very happy to make a very short introduction and get on with the further discussion and answer the questions that our audience might have. Well, when we are talking about the situation in Belarus, obviously it wouldn't be a surprise if I say that the situation looks quite grim. I think we are currently in this tide of repression, which is only going to accelerate, at least in the short term. And that has to do with the main reason, which is the authorities are trying to purge the space to prepare the ground for the constitutional referendum, which is planned for February next year, through which Lukashenko wants to retain his control, to retain power, either through a potential, either through the amendments that would allow him to set a super presidential body and be the head of it, or as indirectly elected president. He probably has not decided yet himself how he's going to do that, and he will be doing what, playing by the ear basically, also looking at how Russia takes the whole situation. Obviously, protests have been suppressed. We still have some sporadic events occurring in Belarus, but the mood on the ground is very much grim. I think people are very much at a loss at the moment. They are looking up to the West for help. There was several months ago Mrs. Tikhanovskaya, who is the leader of the democratic opposition movement residing in Lithuania. She proposed to vote for a international solution to the crisis, to hold an international conference, and I think people in Belarus got very excited about this idea, and more than 600,000 people voted for this. But then it kind of all sort of died out. We know that Mrs. Tikhanovskaya held a conference not long ago, an expert exchange about the future presidential elections, but I think everyone in Belarus understands very clearly that this is the agenda just for the future. And at the moment, it's increasingly hard to do any civic or furthermore political engagement. I heard the other day Maxim Bagritov, a member of the leader of the coordinating council of the opposition, and this is the branch of the opposition which is still in Belarus. He said it very clearly that he can't even think what it would be possible to do in terms of political activism within the next few months. And the coordinating council and Bagritov and people around him who are now setting up a political party called Together, which is obviously a very positive development, but I think they had great plans to try and participate in the local elections that everybody thought would be at the end of this year or next. Or early next year, and we heard about a week ago from the current chairperson of the Central Election Commission that according to the new constitutional amendments that the regime is trying to push through, there won't be any local elections held this year or next year, and that they want to have a single voting day akin to what Russia has. And in that case, then the local elections will be moved further ahead to 2023 and held together with the parliamentary elections. So the only option is, of course, try to mobilize people during the referendum campaign. And several months ago, Mrs. Tikhanovskaya and her team prepared, let's say, an alternative constitutional draft. And there were some positive and some negative comments from the people inside Belarus that they did not feel very happy that it wasn't consulted. They were not consulted so much, but I think the plan of Mrs. Tikhanovskaya was to put it out for debate and to consult with the people at large. But again, all these developments happened several months ago, and now that's also kind of been put on hold, so we don't really know what's happening. So with that, I mean, I think, yeah, as I said, people in Belarus look up to the West. Obviously, we are looking, we are likely to see an increase in sanctions and probably some sectoral and economic sanctions, although we know that the first package which is coming will be again quite limited. There will be only 7 new people put on the list and possibly 1 company. But the EU said that there would be more people, more companies, and there will be sectoral sanctions coming out soon. And that's something I think that authorities in Belarus are now trying to take more seriously. They're talking more about the sanctions, and maybe these sanctions will actually help the opposition, particularly Mrs. Tikhanovskaya and her team in Vilnius, or the team of Mr. Latushka in Warsaw, to be treated more seriously by the authorities and to be seen as a group who can actually influence the West and could influence the imposition or the lifting of sanctions. And that might be some sort of first sign of a potential dialogue that Mrs. Tikhanovskaya has been talking about. a potential sign of national dialogue, but that's again for the future. So at the moment, I think we are looking for more repression in the short term, and I'll probably stop here.
Thank you very much, Katia, for setting that scene for the rest of our discussion. I think I have a lot of follow-up questions about your remarks, so I appreciate that. I will turn it over to Maksimas and then Laurynas.
Thank you, Maia, and I'd like also to thank you for thank the Institute and the Eastern Europe Studies Center for organizing this discussion, and also in a way to second what Katia was just saying when it comes to this sense of a certain vacuum and and depression there in Belarus among the civil society in the country. And in my remarks, I'd like to address the notion of how European is Belarusian democratic movement, something what has been questioned in the very beginning by a number of observers, and also raising concern whether, and maybe justifying also this lack of proportionate response from the European Union to the atrocities and impunity of Lukashenko's regime, by questioning whether the democratic movement in Belarus is really pro-European. And my claim is it is, despite the absence of a geopolitical statement there, and I'll try to explain why. Back then, immediately after the beginning of the protests in August, September 2020, there was a number of bloggers who were interviewed by Deutsche Welle who had to flee Belarus to Vilnius, and in their statement they said that, well, de facto Vilnius has become a political capital of Belarus. And I think this is not just a metaphorical statement, but it is something that can also be traced during the history. Because if you look back in the history, the space of Vilnius has been quite inseparable from the political identity of Belarusians. And in exactly 100 years ago, in this very same city, the first political essay, the first political manifesto, written by Ignat Abdiralović was published, and it's Age Long Way. It was the name of the essay, and also we can recall the very fact that the steering assembly of Belarusian Popular Front, it couldn't assemble in then Soviet Belarus, so it was assembled here in Vilnius, Lithuania, and the ties between people and the horizontal contacts are immense, and therefore support extended to the democratic movement in Belarus has been an inseparable item of Lithuanian foreign policy agenda, starting from the early 2000s, and of course pivotal moments here were both the 2001 presidential elections in Belarus, but also the 2004 referendum, according to which Lukashenko has bypassed the limitation early imposed by the constitution on no more than 2 presidential mandates, and hence has gained the opportunity to run again for president, which he has successfully to a certain extent done in a number of occasions henceforth. But also 2004 has been quite important for Lithuanian foreign policy in regards to extending support to democratic movement in Belarus, and in the result, bringing more and more Belarusians to operate from Vilnius in regards to Belarus and addressing civic engagement in Belarus, also due to the fact that that was the very same year when private university was shut down in Belarus, the European Humanities University, which later has relocated to Vilnius, Lithuania. It was also in right after 2010 presidential elections in Belarus that a group of affiliates of European Belarus movement, that was a movement which has been led by Andrei Sannikov, presidential candidate of 2010 presidential elections. They have settled in Vilnius and put efforts at establishing the political representation of democratic Belarus. This attempt hasn't been that much successful, but still, I believe that the ongoing developments of last 10 months, and especially of the support that has been extended from the Lithuanian authorities, and later I'll try to extrapolate it on Baltic level and EU level, has been quite important because of this significant tectonic shift that has occurred in the Belarusian society and in the aftermath of 2020 presidential elections. And in many respects, it was also driven by articulation of the scale of electoral fraud and falsifications, in addition to, of course, the scale of repressions against innocent people. But articulating falsifications and fraud has been also done from Vilnius, from Lithuania, because one of the two major platforms that facilitated this process, in particular the platform called Zubr, has been organized from here, from Vilnius. And therefore, when we see that in the course of immediate months after the presidential election, more and more Belarusian presence ending up here in Vilnius, it started to institutionalize itself through various forms of solidarity foundations. So this is a completely different approach to establishing the democratic movement and setting the arena, rather than ever before has been done by Belarusian democratic forces. And in this respect, this horizontal structure of separate solidarity foundations, either it be for cultural sphere, or it be for sportsmen, or it be for students or academia or whatnot, or at the end of the day, the largest fundraising and solidarity platform by Sol, operating them, operation of all of them from here, from Vilnius, also justifies the reason why the Lithuanian standing in regards to supporting Belarusian democratic movements has been so vivid and so straightforward. Because at the end of the day, this is not only the issue of over 670 kilometers of the shared border, which Lithuania has with Belarus, but also this immediate presence of Belarusian democratic forces in Vilnius, in addition to Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's headquarters ending up here in Vilnius, Lithuania, which operates in a way as first among equals when the assemblies of democratic forces, they are organized every now and then. Now, of course, the distinctive character and distinctive nature of all these of the democratic movement right now in Belarus is solidarity, and also fight against impunity continuing in Belarus. So in this regard, it is quite evident, at least for me, that not only the sociological data, which is provided whether by studies of Professor Vardamatsky and also by the several surveys conducted by Ryhor Stapenia of Chatham House, but also we see that on the level of on the ideational level, on the value of on the level of values which are driving force of mobilization and the continuing support to democratic movement in Belarus, these are all the very same values that we can find out also articulated in the steering documents of the European Union. So therefore, the indecisiveness and incapacity to respond to impunity taking place in Belarus that is demonstrated by Brussels and by the European Union, this is of course something quite unforgivable. So in my understanding, what we are very likely to observe in the nearest future is that this hope that Belarusians associate with potential external engagement from the West, it will not be materialized, and at the end of the day, this will set the ground for Kremlin to again try to involve in various forms of hybrid warfare, and articulating that the West has basically has gave up Belarusian democratic forces. We see that it's been 10 months since the presidential elections in Belarus. There are 476 political prisoners, and we have twice as less people sanctioned by EU sanctions list, and still the vast majority of them, in fact, they did not suffer from these, 3 sanctions lists so far imposed by the West. So on one end, we have the very decisive standing of Lithuania acting as a champion of Belarus, democratic case. Of course, the immediate coalition building whenever a more resilient action is needed in regards to reaction to impunity in Belarus is built through building up a coalition with Baltic neighbors and also with Poland. Of course, Estonian role as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council has been also used for that purpose. But then the very same level of the denominator which can produce a tangible response to impunity continuing in Belarus is the level of EU encouraged sanctions. And so far, I believe that June 21st, the day when Foreign Affairs Council is expected together, will be a very clear momentum where at the end of the day, Belarusians will be able to see whether EU has capacity to respond, has capacity to react, because so far the response provided by the Brussels has been not just insufficient, it has been disproportionate to the scale of political repressions taking place in Belarus, and by that we can stand that the rhetorics articulated and tweets have nothing in common with the real actions has been done by EU, which is quite disgraceful for the hopes and potential of the democratic movement and its eventual pivot to the EU, because so far the geopolitical demand has not been as a driver of mobilization in Belarus, but the values that Belarusians have been standing so far for, so fighting against impunity, solidarity, these all are the very same values that have served as the basis for European integration more than 60 years ago. So in my statement, I wanted to reiterate that the Belarus democratic movement has been maybe not articulated well, but in its essence has been European-driven movement, standing for the values of EU. However, it was not supported by EU even to the extent to respond to the scale of repressions in Belarus in the course of last 10 months. Thank you.
Maksimas, thank you so much. I think your remarks are so valuable right now, especially as the EU and the US, the West in general, is, you know, very actively being blamed for trying to overthrow Lukashenko. In Lukashenko's narratives, it's the EU that has, you know, done so much to overthrow his regime, but in reality, the West is falling short in supporting, sort of rightfully supporting the democratic movement. So we will talk about this quite a bit more, and I have questions about the US role. Turn it over to Laurynas Jonavičius. Thank you.
Thank you, Maia. Good afternoon to everyone. I will try to cover very briefly very large topic of Russian-Belarusian relations and where it stands at the moment, because Russia is perhaps the most influential factor which gonna affect what's gonna happen next in Belarus. So I'll do brief overview of history of relations and where we are at the moment. So yes, it may look very simple, those relations between Belarus and Russia. However, they are very, very complicated. So very generally, Lukashenko, for being dependent on Russia's support and tied up by membership in many common formats of cooperation like Eurasian Union, the same Union State, Collective Security Treaty Organization and others, has always actually tried to keep maneuvering possibilities open. Yeah? So he is dependent on Russia, but he wants to remain as independent as possible at the same time. That became particularly and very specifically evident after 2014's Russia's aggression in Ukraine. And when Lukashenko realized that being Slavic brother does not mean being secure from Russian, okay, let's call it aggression in any kind of form. So what Lukashenko started to do, he started to look for alternatives, possible to say so. So, of course, we remember Minsk dialogue when Russian, French to discuss what to do with Ukraine. So Lukashenko proudly declared himself a factor of stability and security in Eastern Europe. It was his goal. Belarus de facto did not recognize, and de jure even did not recognize, Crimea's inclusion in Russia, which was a blow into Russia's face. Lukashenko also intensified, for rhetorically first of all, but diversification of Belarus economic dependencies, so-called strategy 30-30-30 was adopted, which meant that Belarus economically should kind of depend 30% on Russia, 30% on West, and 30% on so-called far abroad. He started to look for alternative energy supplies, oil first of all. In 2015-2016, as we remember very well, Lukashenko released political prisoners in an attempt to normalize relations with the West. In a response, European Union suspended sanctions against the regime. So there was a thaw coming in relations between Belarus and West and the European Union especially. What is also important, I would say, that Belarus at the same time refused to accept the de facto Russian military base on its territory with boots on the ground, Russian boots on the ground. Also, Belarus became a legal hub for delivering so-called sanctioned goods from the West to Russian market. If you remember, when Russia imposed counter-sanctions on European goods, Belarus started to export a lot of shrimps and a lot of other strange things to Russia. So it was also kind of an illustration how Belarus looked like a very good partner and friend of Russia, in fact was trying to follow very specific own interests, not Belarus, even actually Lukashenko himself. 2018-2019 were especially problematic in Russian-Belarusian relations. First of all, because Russia changed its previous policies of paying Lukashenko with cheap oil and gas in exchange for loyalty, which means actually not going westwards and preventing color revolution. So Russia started to change that policies. Illustration of that change was so-called Medvedev ultimatum, which came up in 2018, which said that further financial support for Belarus will only be delivered if a union state of Russia and Belarus becomes a reality. Agreement to build such union state was signed back in 1999. However, it has never kind of fulfilled as a working project. In 2019, Russia also started to implement so-called tax maneuver, which is related to oil policies in Russia, and the implementation of that tax maneuver meant that cheap oil for Russia is coming to, for Belarus, sorry, is coming to an end, and actually that put Lukashenko into a very difficult position because everybody knows economically the cost on the cheap supplies of Russian gas and oil and kind of expensive export of refined oil products and other products which are produced on that cheap Russian gas. So economically, Lukashenko was put very strongly in the corner by Russia. At the same time, what is also very important, Lukashenko attempted to normalize relations with United States of America. Remember very well visits of John Bolton and Mike Pompeo end of 2019 and beginning of 2020. A decision was made to reestablish diplomatic relations, which were not existent for almost more than a decade. American ambassador was appointed for not appeared until now in Minsk. Even piloted deliveries of American oil came to Belarus, which was once again a slap on Russian face from its closest, as we usually understand, partner. So in the situation prior to 2020 election, Lukashenko actually was facing much more pragmatic Russian position. Russia was pushing for deeper integration and requiring much more compliant behavior. Belarus, because of that, was facing increasing difficulties in extracting much needed material support. Lukashenko was also looking for alternatives in fostering relations with the EU and US. Domestically, what he was trying to do, of course, he was trying to cut off any possibilities for domestic opposition to rise their heads at the moment presidential election. So prior to elections, problems or increased tensions in relations with Russia, attempts to normalize relations with the West, and increasing, growing actually repressions against domestic opposition or people who raised questions regarding the policies implemented by Lukashenko. Elections themselves proceeded quite unexpectedly, I would say, for Lukashenko. First of all, because very unexpected candidates for the post of president appeared. We remember Mr. Babariko, Tsikhanovsky, Tsepkalo, and these were the people who did not represent the traditional opposition, but actually, unofficially, were related even to Russia, which was not a kind of expectation of Lukashenko, at least at the moment. So what what Lukashenko did, actually, he panicked in the face of those unplanned course of events, and his reaction, I would say, was not very adequate, for perhaps the only possible from his point of view. And we remember very well that at the beginning we were blaming on Russia, Wagner group fighters caught up in Belarus, and other strange stories. However, everything ended up with a very hard repression in relation, first of all, to its own population, own protesters. So the result of the elections, yeah, we know the result, 80% for Lukashenko, but actually they turned into very, very large-scale protest, unseen-scale protest domestically in Belarus. Reacted, as we know very well, with the only effective instrument at his disposition, which was brutal force. So on the one hand, such an approach helped or allowed him to maintain power. On the other hand, actually that approach cut off his exit to the West. He lost his legitimacy in the eyes of the West. In addition to that, he almost fully lost his legitimacy domestically. And so he was pushed actually into the corner. In that situation, in the follow-up of events after election, Russia remained quite ambivalent. To put it very simply, it formally recognized Lukashenko as a winner of elections, but actually was not willing to take any radical steps to help him in dealing with protesters, in dealing with the West. Yeah, so that meant actually that Lukashenko lost the possibility to continue maneuvering between Russia and the West, and de facto remained alone in his negotiations with Putin regarding the conditions of further Russian support. So if we look at what goals Russia is trying to achieve at the moment, especially in its relations with Belarus, I would kind of focus on two most important. So first of them is, of course, to keep Belarus' influence and control over Belarus. However, that kind of translates into the goal or objective to prevent one more color revolution in Belarus. So Russia will not allow protesters to take over the regime, to get rid of Lukashenko, because that would be a very bad sign from Russian point of view. Russia is afraid because of its domestic situation, to put it very simply. On the second very important goal, Russia is trying to take the advantage of the current situation and de facto to finish the absorption of Belarus, and be it very formally, be it informally, but to make it to kind of cut off any possibilities for Lukashenko to go anywhere else except relations with Russia. At the same time, Lukashenko is trying to achieve a little bit different goals. So objectives of Lukashenko and Russia are quite different. So what Lukashenko is trying to do, so for sure, first of all, to maintain power, to remain the leader, president of Belarus. The second thing, he's still also trying to maintain as much, it's possible to call sovereignty as possible, room for maneuver, if you may call that. So yes, he is in full dependency, but what he's really trying to do, and it's really evident, he still wants to be, sovereign, if possible to call. So, however, of course, because of that lost legitimacy domestically and internationally, Lukashenko has very, very few options what to do, how to achieve those goals. So his only hope for a moment, as I believe it, is that Russia not willing to push too hard him, not to complicate Russia's image in the West and in post-Soviet space. That image is very poor already, but Russia is not trying to take very clearly one side, Lukashenko's side, because In the situation when there is a possibility to renew dialogue with United States, we know of upcoming meeting of Putin and Mr. Biden. So at the moment, Russia is waiting and not willing to take radical steps. Russia, so it means it's taking a wait-and-see position, knowing very well that Lukashenko has nowhere to go, to put it simply. Too obvious support for Lukashenko may alienate Belarusian society from Russia, which is an important factor. Moscow is not interested in doing that. Too obvious turn away from Lukashenko. Once again, for Russia risks losing a country to West or to a population option for Russia. Lukashenko's only remaining strategy also is to win as much time as possible for things to calm down, actually. So expectation for sure is that everything gonna come back to business as usual, as it happened after 2006 elections, 2010 elections, and so on. It's not clear what Lukashenko gonna do next, but some indicator hints that he is looking for safe and respectable exit strategy. Not here, not now, not to look weak and not to look kind of pressed by population. So nobody knows how long that may take. Perhaps the planned constitutional referendum, which was mentioned by Katia in the beginning of next year, may be a turning point, but for sure, but not for sure. And of course, there are a lot of other factors that may change the course of events actually very, very swiftly. So what people domestically gonna do, what Lukashenko gonna do with his unpredictable behavior. We remember Ryanair case, what West and how much West gonna do, and also of course what Russia gonna defend, how Russia gonna defend both interests. So this is actually where we are at the moment. For sure, we can go much deeper into every aspect of things I mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Laurynas. Again, I think that lays out the situation with Russia very, very well. From where I'm sitting from the US perspective, I think the calculus is very clear that the situation in Belarus does have, at a minimum, national security implications, right? The Ryanair case is just such a good example of how poorly things can go, right? When you have a situation like in Belarus where the US and the EU haven't been involved too much in doing anything to hold on to power. And that's when mistakes can be made of global scale. We've seen a lot of that in Ukraine during the fighting, whether it was shutting down of jets or, you know, civilian casualties. Belarus is no exception to behavior out of paranoia that is bound to directly affect Western security and strategic interests. I think in addition to that, we've got the Zapad exercises coming up, which is done in coordination, or the Russian military drills. And I know that the NATO and certainly the US are watching that very closely, and they take that development very, very seriously. So considering all of this, we see, and the US obviously has I guess we can still call the Biden administration a new administration. They've only been in place for less than 6 months. So I think there's room for changing in posture, for perhaps deeper engagement, for doing more. And this is where I want to turn to Katia and then Maksimas. Katia, what do you think the US should be doing right now vis-a-vis Belarus? And Maksimas, maybe you could add to this. How can the US and Europe work together to support the democratic aspirations of Belarusians?
Thank you, Maia. That's very good, I think, framework to put it in. And certainly, I think the US has a big role to play. From political perspective, the Lukashenko regime, I think, is really afraid of America. I mean, it sort of respects its power. It's fearful that it might impose certain things that could limit its power. So even therefore, from this point of view, putting, apolitical pressure by the US on Belarus is important and is helpful, and I think we will see that at the upcoming summit between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin, where Belarus, we know, will be raised. Of course, it won't be a major issue, and of course there are other issues that might overshadow Belarus, but I think it would be very important for the US administration to keep pressure, direct or through Russia, on the Belarus regime. The second point, I think, sanctions, economic sanctions, and that what we have seen, that's again, Joe Biden signed in the extension of the sanctions that had existed since 2006, and then they were lifted. These kind of types of economic sanctions that target particular industries, like the oil industry, I'm talking about these 9 companies which are on the US list. I think this is something that, again, the regime in Belarus fears. And this is something that the US has perhaps even, it's easier for it to implement than for the EU, although we understand that if the EU joined that, it would be far more beneficial, because most of these oil products, for example, are traded within Europe and Ukraine, but not in the US. But if there were also secondary sanctions on the US sanctions, that would also help. So I think these 2 things. And the third point I would mention quickly, that I think for me, whatever, I think what we have to remember in Belarus, that society has changed. Society has been changing over the last decades. And during August and before, during the solidarity self-organization during the pandemic, I think it clearly shows that it wants a different future, that it has different values. I agree with Maksimas that these values are far more European, even though people try to avoid in Belarus saying that in order not to upset Russia. But I think with that in mind, society will continue to, one way or another, push its demands. It's very difficult to do so. So whatever US could do to support civil society at the moment, at this very high tide of repression. Last summer and last autumn, we saw a lot of self-organization activity. We saw these informal groups popping up, like informal trade unions, informal doctors associations, informal students associations. And now all that has been put on hold because of this very repressive machinery, legal framework, etc., etc. So obviously, financial resources for these people to fight repression, if someone goes to prison, so that the family of that person can survive, and also capacity sharing, because for 26 years Belarusian civil society did exist. It was very small, but it did not know how to push interests. And now there is a lot of appetite for civil society organization, self-organization, activism. But at the same time, there is lack of skills and lack of tools, because they were never built during the 26 years that Lukashenko has been in power. So any expertise sharing, any capacity building to help these informal groups to stay resilient during the repression and in the longer term to bring about the desired political change, I think that would be also helpful.
Well, I will continue from here, and also point here to articulate is that just a couple of days ago, Lukashenko has signed a number of amendments to Belarusian criminal code. Effectively, there is no rule of law in Belarus unless you are persecuted by the regime. So now, even for the demonstration of the Belarusian historical flag, which is white, red, white flag, basically you risk upending it being treated in accordance with several criminal code articles for extremist activity, and overall this labeling of extremists now, as we see in Belarus, takes place on a daily basis. Belarus Ministry of Information has a list of extremist sources that are banned to access in Belarus. So whenever you open this PDF file, you see that there are more than 80 pages just listing the sources that are banned here. Most of them Telegram channels and various and websites, starting from Radio Free Europe and ending up with even the single largest Belarusian media portal Tutbay, which was effectively destroyed just 2 weeks ago. So in this context, I believe where EU and US effort should be consolidated is a number of objectives. The first, something to second what Katia was saying about sanctions. Belarusian official statistics state that during the Q1 of this year, $431 million US. This is the amount of Belarus oil products export to Netherlands alone, just to the Netherlands alone. So as long as Belarusian oil products are there in the Rotterdam port, basically the regime has all means and tools to continue its existence. Even if we see the reports that the deficit of state budget in Belarus has been increasing, still the amount of of Belarusian state debt is not that tremendous, especially if we compare it in relation to GDP. And there are many more Western European states that have far the far higher ratios. The problem with the Belarusian loans and state debt is, of course, that the vast share of it belongs to Russia. But still, as long as the economic impact on Belarusian regime so far amounts only on exclusion of Belarusian airspace for transit of civic carriers, so basically we talk about the range of between 40 and 60 million US dollars per year. That is more or less the estimation how much did Belarusian air traffic earn from the transit over Belarusian airspace. This is just a drop in the ocean. The second point is, of course, OSCE. OSCE is probably the only remaining institution and organization where both Belarus and European Union and Russia and the United States would be present. The United Nations has demonstrated its incapacity to act, although there were hearings on Human Rights Council and there is also the appointment of a commissioner, but still we see that it's impossible to get past through the veto both of Russia and China. And in this regard, the Moscow mechanism procedure that has been established and the report according to which there is a very clear steps explained what should be taken, what should be done in regards to Belarus through OSCE format. This is something what demands a more resilient action on behalf of EU and the United States. And the third point where EU and US could demonstrate far more significant leadership. And when we talk about impunity, we talk both about political prisoners and the number approaching now 500. We talk about close to 40,000 people who were detained since August. We talk about surpassing 3,000 criminal cases that were opened. We talk about the victims, right? There is a variation in estimating how many victims there were, but at least 7 of them, they are quite confirmed and evidently connected to the actions of Lukashenko's regime. So what Lukashenko obviously is quite afraid of is not only the resilient action of the United States and the pressure it can produce, but also on the fate of the former friends of Lukashenko like Milosevic, like Gaddafi. And this is something, of course, that imposes fear to him, or ending up with the fate of Mr. Yanukovych. So it is impossible to bring up to that scenario without addressing the issue of impunity and initiating persecution for that. There is a number of cases initiated, at least in Lithuania. There are now more than 20 cases that are opened up on the basis of universal jurisdiction, which provides potential to conduct persecution for crimes conducted in a different jurisdiction. There are cases also in Poland. There was a submission of a case in Germany and in Czech Republic. So these are, I believe, the items that demand more significant cooperation between EU and the United States. And in my understanding, June 21st will show quite evidently where EU is capable of taking economic response or not. And this economic response covers not only oil products, but also potash, which also is exported through Lithuania. So therefore, I'm very proud to see that the debate here in Lithuania taking place on that and assessing the real impact that can be done to Lithuanian economy. It is tangible. It is minus 0.9 GDP by the National Bank of Lithuania, but still, this is the amount that you can bear with. So therefore, without EU economic sanctions, US sanctions will not be significant enough because US sanctions so far, although effective since June the 3rd, but they do not cover potash exports, for instance, and also ensuring the secondary sanctions list, so not only primary companies but also their partners, that they also risk up ending on sanctions if they cooperate with the sanctioned companies.
Thank you, Maksimas. I think more sanctions are probably likely to come down the pipeline. I'm sure you've also seen the news that Belarus has banned the U.S. ambassador to Belarus from entering the country, and that obviously is going to merit some kind of a response as well. But in addition to that, I want to turn to Laurynas. Should the West add more sanctions, especially for Lukashenko's moves? If Lukashenko's moves start having financial consequences, like Katia and Maksimas said, to what degree do you think Putin will be able to carry out some of his more extreme agendas in Belarus? I'm talking about the more hard security and military aspects of the Union state idea, for example, or the possibility that the Zapad exercises will lead to something more permanent, like permanent Russian military bases in Belarus. And while I'm there, I have to ask, obviously the Baltic Sea Fleet, the Russian Baltic Sea Fleet, of involvement in the Zapad exercises. How do the Zapad exercises look from Vilnius? How do the Baltics see what's coming in September?
Okay, thank you for the question. Several remarks perhaps to what Maxim and Katia said and regarding what you asked, should there be more sanctions? For sure there should be, but this is theory. This is the problem is, and if we only, we say that we need to impose more sanctions, that gives us only one part of the picture and does not kind of bring the whole picture, which we need to see. And that whole picture is much more problematic. So for sure, more sanctions would cause problems for Lukashenko. The problem with more sanction is that, West, I'm not talking about Lithuania. Lithuania is ready. It's ready to suffer for its port, for exports of potash and everything else. However, when we look from Washington, I would say, position, Berlin position, Paris position, I see the problem, the first problem is that Belarus does not matter so much as Russia. And when it comes to dealing with Belarus in the West, there always going to be Russia first problem. Yeah? That means that if doing something harder regarding Belarus would cause problems in relations with Russia, West would not do that. It's my understanding. I don't want to look like pro-Lukashenko or not kind of supporting his regime, but this is the reality. One thing, a very important thing I would say we have to bear in mind. Another thing when it comes to the kind of consequence of sanctions, one thing, it was mentioned already that sanctions would cost us as well. Yeah? So, but it's understandable. Yeah. So if we impose sanctions, naturally we will lose something as well. Yeah. So oil products, the same potash. For potash is not going to the West; it's going to Brazil, India, Malaysia, and other countries. But we'll lose something. Other problem, one more thing to mention, is that cost and benefit calculation of Lukashenko is not the same we do it here in the West at the moment. Yeah, he is able to carry much bigger costs just to keep to attain his goal in terms of remaining in power. So if we calculate that Belarus economy would lose quite a lot because of imposing sanctions on oil and fertilizers, that may not be the case in Lukashenko's calculation. Yeah? And there is one more additional thing important. So sanctions works best when they are multilateral, when they are imposed by everyone around. In Belarusian case, there is an exit strategy. Okay, Russia, we know it very well, which also leads to one more problem that by imposing harder sanctions, we may push, it's not necessarily going to happen, but we may push Belarus stronger into Russian hands. And Russia would have more instruments to kind of take those assets which it wants to take in Belarus, but Lukashenko was not giving up until the moment. Yeah, the same oil refineries, the same Belarus Kali and other companies. So there are problems. Yeah, I'm not saying that we should not move on with sanctions, because if we don't move on with sanctions, so Russia will laugh at us, Belarus will, Lukashenko will laugh at us, and in the future nobody want to say something, support something, and do anything, to put it very simple. So for sure there is a need, but for sure we should manage expectations, I should say. Yeah, we should declare not only that by imposing sanctions we will kind of make regimes suffer very much, but also to understand that that suffering will have additional elements related to that. When it comes to Zapad exercises, so it's a problem for sure, but it's not. It's a problem for some time already in Baltic states. We already had Zapad 2017, yeah, which was against West very generally. Yeah, Lukashenko was not trying to kind of associate himself very much with those exercises. However, Russia was willing. At the moment, those Zapad exercises, for sure, they may be a pretext to kind of remain in Belarus, as you say. But we don't have to forget that at the beginning of this year, Russia and Belarus signed an agreement on the establishment of training base for common kind of air force on Belarus territory, which may also be treated as seen as a kind of possibility for Russian troops to remain in Belarus. So there is that threat is always there. It's not disappearing. It's not changing. It's for sure increasing. But problem is, what can we do to kind of stop it or prevent it? And so yes, declarations and statements that don't do that on Western side, they should be there, but whether they will work in regard to Russia, in regard to Lukashenko, I'm not sure. Very much will depend actually on what Mr. Biden and Putin will agree on in Geneva end of this month. Maybe they won't talk about Belarus relations going to develop. It can have quite a big effect on how Western Belarusian relations can change or cannot change. So at the moment, we should wait and we should look at what Americans actually are doing and saying to Putin at the moment.
Yeah. Thank you, Laurynas. Maksimas, Katia, I know you both have comments on the security dimension.
Yes, there is just a minor detail that I wanted to add also, and seconding what Laurynas was saying, because in addition to security threats imposed by Zapad trainings that are occurring on every second year, there is another threat which becomes more and more materialized, and this is the threat of illegal export from Belarus. In May alone, both in regards to Poland and Lithuania, we had record high illegal attempts of illegal cargoes with cigarettes and the estimating was at the price of $10 million and surpassing those. Basically, for the entire last week, we see that on a daily basis there are illegal migrants who are facilitated by Lukashenko's regime to illegally cross Belarus-Lithuania border, and every now and then we get reports of 20 to 50 illegal migrants coming into Lithuania, and by that we see that these are also hybrid attempts of imposing additional security threats to Lithuania, but indirect and unconventional threats, right? And for that purpose, of course, realizing that Lithuania and Poland, they have the largest chunks of Belarus NATO border, Belarus EU border. Lukashenko has stated this very openly, that he will basically no more stop, in his words, illegal contraband and migrants from Belarus to the EU.
Coming from Belarus or from somewhere else via Belarus?
No, from somewhere else, and mostly coming
Okay.
from Iraq, from Syria, but transiting through Belarus. There are, of course, every now and then those civic activists from Belarus who are forced to flee their home country, and they are illegally crossing border as well, but this is not comparable in terms of figures. So, and therefore, it's hard for me even to imagine what will be the figures of these illegal migrants by September, before Zapad actually starts, because so far these figures they are quite impressive, quite threatening, and even the additional assistance from the EU was requested in order to provide additional staff capacity for Lithuanian border guard service to deal with this additional inflow of illegal migrants who are effectively facilitated by Lukashenko's regime.
Thank you. Katia, did you have a comment? Okay. Yeah, I think there's quite a bit to discuss here, and I want to encourage our audience to keep sending in their questions as well. I have a question here about COVID vaccines. So actually, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the COVID situation in Belarus in general. We haven't spoken about that in quite a while. The last time I checked, Lukashenko was not even in acknowledging the fact that COVID was that big a danger. The question here says that the EU has, over 1 billion doses of vaccine that it could be giving to Ukraine, Belarus, and even Kaliningrad. Do you, I'd love to hear more about this, because how do you aid in vaccine when the government essentially says, I guess they don't need it because COVID is not a thing? Who can comment on this?
Yeah, I can do. Well, the situation with COVID is really very bad in Belarus. I think the government, the regime has recognized the problem, but we're still getting obviously very low figures, which are very far from the real statistics on the number of cases and the number of deaths, which is literally around 9 or 10 people every day. So it would have been funny had it not been so tragic, because literally every day you get plus 10 deaths. The vaccination rollout has been very slow. The main reason for that is that there isn't enough capacity, that obviously there were all these kind of PR talks about Putin giving Sputnik vaccine, etc. But I think Russia doesn't have enough of its own capacity to cover cities outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg. And as a result, Belarus had very small dose, very small batch of vaccines. For example, I saw the last statistics was, one of the latest, at least, statistics was on the of 26th of April, and it cited that only 0.1% of the whole population of Belarus has been covered, has been vaccinated. Now I think the figure is slightly high, about 5 or 6%, but it's still far from proper vaccination campaign. China gave a batch of vaccine, a small batch of vaccines. I think at the beginning of the year, there was information, I think about today, that United Arab Emirates, if I'm not wrong, purchased some of the Chinese vaccine for Belarus. In April, the Belarusian local medical company using the Russian Sputnik vaccine, and that is kind of the hope that that would accelerate by the autumn, and sometime in September there would be a more or less enough sufficient number of doses. But people are really, I mean, officially there are 4 stages that people are supposed to get vaccinated by. And like the first stage was supposed to be social workers and medical workers. But we still don't, there are people even in that category, like, for example, teachers, university professors who haven't really been vaccinated. people, elderly people, they also don't fit into any category. And I think we have now a very diverse situation. It basically all depends on how many people are attached to one particular practice, medical practice. What is the catchment area, basically? And I can, share anecdotal experience about Minsk, only that, for example, in some parts of Minsk, further away from center, people in their 60s are now getting invitation to come and vaccinated, but people living in the center of Minsk, where there are fewer medical practices, and people even in their late 70s haven't been vaccinated yet. And of course, talking about the recognition, the sort of, Sputnik and giving the vaccine, yes, of course, the EU should do that if there are extras. But also, I think what would be important is to think for the EU about the Sputnik vaccine. And if the Sputnik vaccine meets the requirements, and there was some information, a study published in the Lancet, I think, medical journal, that confirmed that it basically met all the it went through the trial phases. If there is a way to, if it meets the criteria to recognize it as a legitimate vaccine, that would also help, because obviously cannot travel now because there is Belarus. The national air company has also been blocked from flying within Europe. But people before that were very much looking forward to at least going on holiday later in the year, maybe, to Europe, but they could not do that because obviously the Sputnik is not recognized. So something along those lines would be, I think, very helpful, either extra vaccines that could be delivered to Belarus, or recognizing the Sputnik vaccine. And in that context, maybe I should make a remark about the whole situation, about these sanctions on the Belarus, on the Belarusian national company. I think people in Belarus are really not very happy with that, because they do suffer. And from the perspective of, international, or from a human rights perspective, it's more like locking the oppressor with the oppressed, because people, the land border has been closed in Belarus since December. And for people, the only way to leave Belarus was actually to travel by Belarus, because European airlines, not so many actually do fly to Belarus. And now even those people who were thinking that they could go to like Montenegro or other countries which recognize Sputnik, they cannot do now. And people in Belarus, I think we have to remember, they live in constant fear, constant duress. If you talk to the people there, they even say going to Russia for a day feels different, that they are under this pressure that they might be just, captured somewhere in the middle of the street. And for them not to be able to travel to Europe, I think it's very, very harmful for people who live inside Belarus.
Thank you, Katia. I want to ask one last question, because we're unfortunately running out of time, but especially when Ms. Tsikhanouskaya's essentially government in exile, right? And so many well-wishers and so many also just dissidents who don't live currently in Belarus. This makes me ask about the information space. What does the information space look like within the country right now? How easy it is for someone like Ms. Tsikhanouskaya to send her messages, to communicate with the locals, with her supporters? But also, how easy is it for scholars, researchers, experts who are inside Belarus to do their work and get their work to the West, to our eyes and ears? And in that regard, what can the West do to help not just secure the information space, but add counter any disinformation that exists in that information space right now?
Well, I can kick off and state that effectively working in Belarus now, whether it be for journalists or for scholars, this is as if you are working in the battlefield. And for that reason, of course, Belarus has always been prominent by insufficient let's say, possibilities for scholars to carry out sociological studies, for instance, right? There is always an issue on reliable sociology from Belarus, right? There are only very, very few studies that are carried out that, you know, can be trusted upon. And of course, this imposes a significant issue for, you know, for the research discourse and overall on trying to assess the mood in the public, although carrying out his sociological studies in Belarus for decades, so we can also trace the change in the mood of Belarusian society. And you know, the last year has been quite vivid in that regard. But also when it comes to information space, well, with after destroying Tutbay, which has not only been the largest Belarusian media portal with over 60% of Belarus internet segment as their daily audience, but the entire ecosystem, of course, Belarusian information space has eventually shifted to Telegram app, and we've seen the dramatic increase of subscribers in Telegram app in the Tutbay account of within Telegram app. But nevertheless, still the possibilities that Telegram provides, they are very helpful in spreading the news, but they are not so sufficient when it comes to longer materials, right? Longer formats, whether it be investigative journalism or it be some other forms of, you know, materials that normally journalists have. And basically, being a journalist is one of the most dangerous professions now in Belarus. Over 30 media-related persons, they are now detained in Belarus. Tutbay alone had 15 members of their editorial team who were detained and still remain under detention. Needless to mention the other cases of, you know, journalists from Belsat and Radio Free Europe and elsewhere who've been detained and charged for making live streaming or just doing their journalistic duty. So therefore, of course, Belarusian information space is on one end, this empowers people and this empowers gonzo journalism in many respects, but on the same time, we see that every now and then, as for example with the case of hijacking of Ryanair flight, there are more and more attempts also from Kremlin-backed activists to spread disinformation in Belarusian media space, for example, as has been the case with Roman Protasevich. We have seen immediately all this wave of accusations in regards to Roman when it comes to his presence in Ukraine in the aftermath of 2014, etc. So these attempts, of course, to infiltrate to Belarusian information space, and to conduct different sorts of cover-up you know, attempts will carry on, but also what Belarusian authorities are doing, they are every now and then arresting administrators of those Telegram channels. And we've seen very many examples of these actions, and basically taking over these remaining islands of you know, free spread of information. And hardly there are any promising you know, possibilities here. It's a good sign that Deutsche Welle, for instance, they said that they will be opening up a Belarus-specific editorial team that will be working exclusively with Belarus. Of course, immediately in the aftermath of presidential elections, the work has been done by independent media of Belarus, like Tutbay or Onliner.by or Nasha Niva and Eurasia, etc. That has been very important, but not their appearance on the ban list and effectively being blockaded in Belarus, but also labeling them, you know, as extremist organizations is a very tangible possibility that most likely will be materialized very soon, whenever these amendments to the criminal code will become effective. As I mentioned, this is most likely the information space will become more sterile, at least in accordance with Lukashenko's perspective.
Okay. Well, I think with that, we're going to end this discussion. I would like to thank each of you, Laurynas, Maksimas, Katia. Thank you for joining this discussion today. Thank you for such informative remarks. I learned so much today, and I really hope that we can continue the conversation. I'd like to thank our audience members for joining us, for supporting Eastern Europe Studies Center and the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.